What's on your mind about coalition building in a state of hypercapitalism?
I was really excited actually when I got asked to this podcast, and I thought it was prime time to talk about coalition building. It's something we talk about a lot within Breathe, the utopian dream of resistance, building power, rooting the working class and racialised communities with all marginalised groups. And what does that look like in a world where we're seeing increasing crisis, hyper-individualisation, and I would say divisions across the board on local levels as well as at international levels. We're in a different era when the Rainbow Coalition was born in the 1960s, I would say.
Can you contextualize that a little bit?
Yes, certainly. So the Rainbow Coalition was born in the 1960s. It was spurred on originally. When I say spurred on, it was initiated by the Black Panthers, and it was a progressive and fundamentally socialist movement. Poor People's Army, that was said by Chacha, and he was founder of the Young Lords. So it was a coalition between the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and they were young Latinos and young patriots, and they were a street organization of white youths. And there was tension and trepidation about these different groups working together, particularly as the white youths had the Confederate flag as one of their emblems. However, they did manage to bridge these divides and create a coalition where they were able to create resistance on various fundamental issues that are affecting all of them, including economic inequality, living conditions, police brutality, and it was all embedded in deep organising in each of their communities as well.
You said something about hyper-individualism as being kind of part of our current political crisis or moment. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think that in terms of coalition building and in terms of the movement as a whole, I think that we are in a space, and we have been for a long time, where capitalism took a new hold round about the development of neoliberalism and so on, where we put individual rights above the collective, and that makes it often difficult to form bridges across divides.
I find this quite an amusing conversation because often people speak of the individual and the collective as separate, antithetical even, as though the two are not necessarily linked, whereby they inform each other, because when you help the collective, you help the individual. But going back to coalitions, when they are by nature alliances that look to be broad, what are the internal challenges around dynamics of power? Going back to the Black Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition, their programs were co-opted by the state, because when you're that powerful and effective in building dual power and black autonomy, the state is threatened and will do everything in its power to stop and disrupt you. However, the state's ability to interfere can be facilitated by internal power dynamics. We've got to ask the question, where does power lie? Because when the state began infiltrating, assassinating and murdering leaders, the structures, often patriarchal in nature, were weakened, as the absence of leaders heavily impacted their ability to organise effectively. So how do we have leadership? How do we organise with each other? How do we build coalitions that don't centralise power with a few select individuals? Because the second those individuals leave or are intentionally assassinated and removed, what do we do? I know we've shared insight in how to maintain relatively horizontal structures in our episode on the tyranny of structurelessness, but how do we fit this within the context of coalitions? Does a coalition necessitate said individuals because of its broad nature, or can we implement elements such as rotational roles, delegation, distribution of power, as spoken about previously in that episode?
Yeah, I think disrupting power and making sure we're constantly questioning that is a really, really important thing. We should also recognise from a starting point that all social movements and movement organisations, I would say as a whole, are shaped by privilege and power. And it's deep and slow and clumsy work to try and undo this. So the Black Lives Matter movement, and if you compare that to the civil rights movement, so this was obviously the largest resistance and mass mobilisation against racism that we'd seen in 40 years. And there was lots of similarities in terms of the organising that took place on the ground, and the women did a lot of the work in both these spaces. But one of the key differences was in the Black Lives Matter movement was the rejection of patriarchy and the rejection of hierarchical structures in the same format, which was a strong feature of the civil rights movement, right? Women were also powerful in the civil rights movement, and Erica Huggins has actually just released a book, hasn't she, on the women of the civil rights movement, which is meant to be a beautiful read, and I can't remember the name of it from the top of my head. So from this point of view, there was an intentional approach to disrupt power, and it's Alicia Garza said very clearly that if we're not creating systems that disrupt power and they do not embody the change, then we're not uplifting the people who are centre to the injustice. And I suppose there's a question of, do we wait for the transformative change to happen before we pass the mic and pass the pedestal, so to speak, or do we actually embody that change ourselves? I don't think any movement entirely gets it right, but is a clumsy and slow and awkward, and actually having lots of grace in our clumsiness as we explore what this means. I think in terms of actual power, leaderful organising, obviously that's a term that's used a lot nowadays, and that is the idea of we create lots of leaders. We create leaders within the communities who are the most impacted. impacted, and we raise them up. So they're the people that invite and invoke the change. And they're also leaders that are obviously trusted within the community. So you're creating broad coalitions of trusted individuals instead of having one person at the top that all the burden falls upon.
I am nodding because I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts and reflections on when you as an organizer would use a coalition. When would you consider it useful as a tool?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because obviously coalitions are not things that just exist in the past, right? They're very current today. And I think often when we think of coalitions as well, we think of them at the kind of the top level, like the big names like Stop the War Coalition, the Climate Chaos Scotland, the COP26 Coalition. And these being such big coalitions with such big players in them, I think there is limited opportunity to disrupt power. There's limited opportunity to enact and embed the change that we want to see. And that's really, really important. How big and how broad do we want to go, or how true to transformative change do we want to be? Do we want to remain? Within local communities, there's obviously lots of scope, and community coalitions, I would say, is a far bigger thing in the US, as far as I understand, than it is in the UK. But there's obviously lots of scope for creating coalitions on a local level as an organizer. So that could be individuals of a community that want to address poor public transport in the area, that want to oppose the closing of a local health clinic, that want to look at community-owned energy in the area. In terms of local organising on, for example, a city level, I mean, what we're seeing in a lot of places in the UK, and what we've been seeing for quite a few months, and it has been the kind of the theme of the last 6 months, is the increasing collaborations between different organisations that are fighting around about workers' rights, that are fighting about cost of living. There's a myriad of organisations and issues that are beginning to see more collaboration amongst each other. Has that reached over to organising yet, and in particular the deep organising communities? I wouldn't say it has as a whole yet in the UK, but I think there's a lot of potential around about this space to create more movement building and more coalition building.
That's really interesting. I do wonder, like, listening to you, whether there's a question around, like, is using the term a community coalition or a coalition in an organising sense useful? When is it useful? Are we creating collectives? Are they cooperatives? Are they forums? So perhaps maybe you could help us understand how you understand what a coalition is. And when do you think you would use one if you were on a kind of roadmap as an organizer? Like, at what point does it become a really important tool? Or perhaps it's not a word that you want to use and there are other more appropriate words. Now, words can be really important in creating understanding.
Language is important. Language is both important as it is fluid, right? So not everything's going to strictly fall into one category. Depending on the context, depending on the era, depending on the individuals you're working with, the language very much is important. So I would also bring movements into that set of words that we could be looking at right now. So a collective might be a group of individuals that decide to loosely come together. I would say a coalition is units of different entities that already exist. Some of them might already be individuals, but these different entities would represent different demographics fighting for change in their area. And when they come together, there is enough overlap for them to want to fight together, to build power, to fight either for larger systemic change or around about a value or around about a targeted outcome, if that's around about policy to do with health, whatever that looks like. Whereas obviously coalitions and movements obviously have a lot of overlap as well. I would say a movement is more than open-ended surge of energy for social change, and it's often based around a value. And it'll often have a broad base of activists and organisations that coalesce together for around about one aim. But you can feel it in the zeitgeist. The movement has a very distinct feeling around about it, right? It's the kind of questions that are being asked at the time. It's been the way that we challenge each other. It's the values and the way that we scrutinise our values. Often coalitions are formed in response to opportunities and threats, I would say, but they need to build on existing and mobilising structures, right? If that's stuff that already exists within organisations and within networks. This is also where the power of coalitions come in. Coalitions can bridge social movements as well, right? They can bridge social movements across race, across class, across environmental issues. And that's, for example, what the COP26 coalition looked to do, right? So it looked to bring these different issues and these different movements, so to speak, the labour movement with the racial justice movement, with the environmental movement, to fight for the bigger cause, which was seen as climate injustice. I also think coalitions can be really important because they say that all these issues that we are individually fighting fighting for. So a collective might be a group of individuals that come together that all care about one issue. A coalition is where we say all these individual problems have the same root cause. I've spoken about before, I've got problems with the word allyship because I think it kind of assumes that you've done the work, that you're already there, that racism doesn't exist within us. Or if you look at genuine solidarity, what you're saying is your experience is not about my experience. There is no comparison. I do not listen to your pain whilst reflecting on my pain. I stand here in solidarity to listen to your pain, to listen to your needs and be there when I can be there for you. So I think coalition building can be really interesting because I think it can allow space for more genuine and useful solidarity. And I think it can allow us to understand that there is a common cause that is kind of bigger than these individual issues as well.
I would have thought political alignment or maybe political priorities or organising priorities are really important in a coalition. I'm starting to question that a little bit. Like, do you think it's important that in a time where climate defenders are at risk of increased police brutality and state intervention into our activism? With that in mind, the coalition spaces, I suppose, or the kind of collective spaces that we create also become safety spaces. Now, having listened to you talk, that feels like it's kind of a defensive space. How important is it that they are broad? How broad are they? And do we really require everyone to come into that space with a shared idea of what allyship means, solidarity means, and racial justice means? And what do we do when people don't? Because inevitably we're all so different.
On solidarity, what is it? Is it an action? Is it the statement that we are in solidarity? Do you know what I mean? Because we always say that. We always hear that. Like, what does that mean? Like, okay, say it, sure, but what does that actually mean? Like, what are you doing?
Oh my God, I'm having an existential crisis. I even sign off my emails in solidarity, for goodness sake.
But like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? Like, what are you actually doing to be in solidarity? Or are you just saying that because it's like, yeah, I support you, lol. Now, how can we actually like actively support each other, and how do we actually demonstrate that solidarity, not just as something we say, but as something we do? If solidarity is something we do, and if it's not, then we can't just be in solidarity. Another thing that you brought up there was the matter of scaling. By nature, these are broad things. By nature, the COP26 coalition was broad. I think what distinguishes it quite significantly from, say, the Rainbow Coalition in the States is the political climate that it was born out of, right? Because these are massive NGOs, these are individuals, these are groups, these are organizations coming together, working at a national level. You've got your coordinating committee is what we called it, right? And then you have your working groups. Like we also had the hubs, more local level, because of course that's necessary. But again, like I think it's really important to think about the context that this came out of. The way that Black, Brown, POC communities exist in the States is very different to how they exist in the UK. There's been years of work, there's been years of solidarity. We don't have that, right? There was not this cross solidarity between different elements of the working class, as highlighted in the Rainbow Coalition. This is a bunch of middle class folk, part of NGOs, part of organizations that have enough time on their hands to do essentially what is volunteering work. Some of them paid, by the way, myself not included, because young people never get paid to do shit. Our coalitions are existing for completely different reasons. You know, you have essentially what is a food program, again, co-opted by the state because it was that powerful, because it was that strong, because it was that threatening. We didn't do that. We are not doing that. The function was completely different and entirely born out of its context. So, like, what relevance does it actually have to our context, especially in relation to our work as Breathe?
The question of size, of breadth, and to what level do you want to interrupt power is, I think, all really, really important, right? To the aims and why you're forming a coalition. The COP26 coalition, obviously, that was incredibly broad. The remit was to broadly hold the left, and the left is a very, very big, diverse, and at times problematic space, right? The aim was to hold the left together as the UN came to town, and I could describe the UN, the COP, the Conference of Parties, as a killing machine, effectively. Every year that they land in a different country and they decide on who lives and who dies. And that, so the idea was to hold the left together, so we're not pointing our guns at each other, but we're pointing them at the governments and the powers that be, the corporations as well. And it was very successful in doing this. And it brought together trade unions, it brought together the environmental movement, it brought together different economic justice groups, racial justice groups, and so on. And in terms of outputs, it ticked all the boxes. You know, the biggest mobilisation had ever been in Scotland and the UK around about climate justice, 800 actions around the world, huge conference of 250 sessions. The purpose of the COP26 coalition was to be a leverage for movement building. So that is the change, the energy, the momentum that looks for a value shift within society, a cultural shift of what we say is right and wrong and how we behave within that. And that shift needs to happen at an institutional level if we do see a shift. So in terms of ticking the boxes of the wins of the coalition, it managed to do that for the COP. In terms of actually changing the movement, I think that's a larger discussion, which, you know, I'm very, very much willing to have those time to do that today. What I think is really, really important is, can we see shifts at that scale of kind of broadness? So you've got that at the UK international level, then you bring that down to the local hubs. The local hubs were generally white, middle class, environmental individuals. Not everywhere by any means. We did have a trade union caucus. There were migrant justice groups involved as well. But on the ground, the level hadn't been done in terms of building the trust and the solidarity to include the groups that are actually absolutely fundamental to climate justice. So in terms of scaling it, that was acceptable at the international level. At the local hub level, what we were seeing was the same environmental demographic. For me, that's not climate justice, and that is not interrupting the power systems. And I think this is maybe the limits of kind of broad coalition building. And this is where we see the compromise between size and scale versus integrity to the changes that we want to see. And obviously, we know many kind of coalitions, kind of that I was mentioned before, at the larger level: Stop the War, Stop Climate Chaos, Raise the Roof, a brilliant Irish one round about housing rights, trade unions as well. They often work in coalitions, so to speak. Often the bigger the organisation, the less tolerance there is for, I'd say, more radical groups and ideas. And when I say radical, we know that the Latin word radical simply means root. And for me, that's more rooted in justice. So if you bring it from the small level, the small local level, and then you've got the country or international level, the spaces in between might be the citywide level. The Rainbow Coalition, they were working in a citywide stroke city kind of area kind of level. I think today we are seeing that to be increasingly difficult in terms of transformative change at the citywide level. And I think that's because the rise of, I would say, individualism, divisions, and ego as well. There's a lot of often loud voices, and there are often lots of loud white men at the top that are not willing or prepared to put aside their ways of organizing, their ways of communication, their practices, let alone go through the really difficult process that the patriarchy doesn't allow. That's around about self-reflection, that's around about vulnerability, that's around about the space that I take up, the power that I hold. Why do I need to be centered to this space, to this organizing? That's a whole conversation again that we could have separately around about fragility and vulnerability within movement leaders.
So we've talked a bit about the climate hubs. I don't know that much about them, but from what I'm hearing from you, there needs to be some kind of work around making those hubs more relatable so that the space isn't kind of taken up by people with more privilege. So what kind of organizing tactics would you use to do that? How do we change that? How do we intervene?
I think something that has come from this conversation is that we don't necessarily rely on coalition building. We can learn from each other and be like, oh, this was an interesting strategy. It worked in this place. We can apply it to another. But you've also got to understand that there needs to be flexibility and contextual understanding of where we are. Coalitions such as the Rainbow Coalition is something that, at least in my context, in my part of the UK, wouldn't be able to be done. I don't think, not effectively, not meaningfully, and for who, for what. But like, as a community organizer, Tess, how would you perhaps approach this? How would you make those building blocks where coalition building then becomes relevant? Like, what tactics do we use? What tactics have people used that we can learn from?
Yeah, these are really vital questions. I think on the local hub level, we can use just local hubs as a template, but you're talking about the local level, right? And I do think that that is the level where more power building between different marginalised groups, or where groups that have been marginalised by the system can take centre, is more possible and more genuine and has more integrity. One issue that you might see in spaces where coalitions already exist is that when someone comes to the table, and they're like, there's no one like me sitting at this table, and I need to deal with the power dynamics that already exist within this space. And I have no reason to yet trust that these people deeply care about me and the issues in my world. It's hard to change that dynamic. And for me, I very much believe that you need to be clear who's at the table and who's holding the power to begin. It can be an unsafe space to feel, and it can inflict more pain, and it can be incredibly slow and not necessarily that effective. So I think that's a really important point when we think of the spaces that already exist, that might exist in coalition, and the difficulties to move them to a space where they represent those who are most impacted, and they are actually with integrity fighting for a systematic change. As we know, the foundations for a lot of this work, and this is where the organising work comes in, is building trust and is building relationships. And that is work that takes place, knocking at people's doors. I was talking to someone recently, and the work that's going on in Glasgow right now around about cost of living campaigns, and kind of recognising a lot of the organising work isn't taking place yet, because the organising work takes place at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning in a freezing community centre. None of it's glamorous. progress. None of it's even that exciting. A lot of the time, it's a slow, gentle getting to know each other and getting to know each other's needs and getting to know each other's dynamics within that space kind of work. Organising is the long game, and to build the foundations that we need, not just to build coalitions to fight the fights today round about energy prices, this winter, and how energy prices continue over this summer to next winter, but how do we build the foundations in a world that's slowly collapsing is the long and slow work. And I think that needs to be understood. So this is where, the big switch from the COP26 coalition, the mobilising to the organising, if we're serious about keeping people safe and doing so by building collective power in the streets that we live on.
But then, how do we balance that with the urgency of the crisis? Because we're constantly in these intersectional crises, like health, cost of living, climate, in order to kind of get to that place where the coalitions can have impact or build towards real change, transformative change, and balance that with the urgency of the crisis. With our work at Breathe, we get asked quite a lot, and I'd really love to hear your reflections on how do you answer that question?
So how do we balance deep and effective foundation building with urgency? And I think this is a really poignant question right now because there's lots of crucial thinking, lots of wisdom around acting without urgency or resisting that feeling of urgency. And I think that's a really important conversation to have post-COVID in times of escalating crisis. In the UK, as we're seeing, after the COP and the climate movement and the emergence of lots of direct action organisations, that the whole messaging is round about we're all going to die. And acting with this urgency obviously has huge damage, right? It has huge damage at a spiritual level, at a collective level, at the movement level of how we look after each other and how we keep the cogs of the machine sustainable and functioning whilst recognising the urgency already exists. The amount of people that are facing cold homes this winter, anyone who says we need to learn to act without urgency, would they be brave enough to say this to people in the global south that are seeing the hard face of climate breakdown today? Communities are already dying from this. So yes, we're in a state of multiple crisis and urgency to keep this planet an inhabitable space, which is already increasingly not so many places. And I think this is where coalition building can come in helpful, because you are building off the tactics from a lot of different groups. Coalitions need to lean on the mobilising and the organising and the processes of different groups that already exist. So all the learnings are already out there, right? And really importantly, we know that the infrastructure is out there and it has been practiced in many places. It doesn't mean when you pick it up and you put it in your community that we don't need to take in the historical context, that we don't need to take in the trauma of the activists, that we don't need to take in the division, that we don't need to take in the different needs. But like I say, all these processes have been lived out in different places all over the world. We also need to begin to enact the change. So as I was saying before, we need to give grace and space for that to be kind of clumsy and awkward as we apply different ways of different kinds of leadership, different kinds of communication, different kinds of ways that we meet. And maybe I'm just talking from a place of pure optimism, but I do believe that there is space to meet and to gather and to organise and to act in response to the emergency that we're in, whilst trying to explore and develop and live with integrity our values around about care and justice and relationship building at the same time, and admitting that we don't get it perfect, because that's a really classic problem. We regularly don't get things right. We destroy each other as well. And of course we don't get everything right because we live in a horrifically imperfect system. So I think grace around that learning curve is really crucial within this.
I mean, I could sit next to the campfire and talk to you both all night long, which I think we should actually do in person, in real, with an actual fire, because that would be amazing. But I do also know that Tess is a grassroots organizer and has a whole day out there. This has filled me with a bit of fire in my belly to go back out there and rethink things and challenge some of the ideas that we potentially initially started Breathe with, and start evolving and emerging and trying new things. So thank you so much, Tess.
A pleasure. Thank you too, both.
This has been Campfire Stories, brought to you by Breathe. Check out our socials where you can hear directly from our community organisers who are doing the work. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel, and keep up to date with our future episodes.